And in the course of travel, we both crossed the equator and got to the top of the escarpment there, which was, like I said, about 5,000 feet above the floor of the valley at about the same time, and when we crossed the equator. So it's an interesting geological formation. But this rift valley goes right on up through Africa and over into the area of the Great Sea, Great Salt Sea, and goes up in the eastern part of the land of Israel to the east of the Jordan River, which is now Arabia, and right on into Mesopotamia, which is what Bill was talking about, the great rift that has so much earthquake activity. And probably the reason the Dead Sea is about, 800 feet below sea level, is because of the sinking of the soil during the earthquake period over the last several thousand years, causing that to be the lowest point on earth, and also containing water from the Jordan River, which runs into it, but it doesn't have an outlet where it can run out. Any other question before we start our study on the kingdom of Israel and Judah? Let's begin today with a story that's a very, very short story, but it's a sweet story, and one that we wouldn't want to miss in our study of the Old Testament, because it's important in the genealogy study of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, who came several years later, as you know. There were 5 different segments of generations from Adam to the coming of Christ, and they're divided up very interestingly into 2 periods of time where you have 10 generations. There was 10 generations between Adam and the flood when Noah came onto the scene. Then there were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, and that seemed to mark the period of the time when people lived to be quite old age. We recall how that Methuselah and Jared lived over 900 years. So did Adam, so did Noah, and some of the other ones that lived during the period from the Garden of Eden unto the flood. So we had 10 generations from Adam to Noah, and then 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. And then after that, you had 14 generations from Abraham to David. Then there were 14 generations from David to the end of the captivity. And then there were 14 generations from the end of the captivity to the coming of Christ. So you had 5 different sets of generations. 2 of them were 10 generation periods, and the other 3 were 14 generation periods. You'll find that recorded in Matthew, the 1st chapter, and verse 17. But in that generation line, there was a kind of a strange story that occurred from a foreign national. And during right near the end of the period of the Judges, there was a story regarding a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi. And by now you recognize it's a story of Ruth and Oprah and Naomi. Elimelech was apparently a farmer, and there was a drought in the land of Israel where he lived around Bethlehem, and so he went eastward over into the land of Moab, and he stayed over there about 10 years. But in the course of the events while he was there, he had 2 sons that he carried over there, Mahlon and Chilion, and those 2 boys married Moabitish women, Oprah and Ruth. And they lived there for the period of 10 years before Naomi came back, but the men of the family died. I don't know whether they died in a war or whether they died of plague or pestilence or sickness or whatever. But Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion died, and it left the three women, Naomi and her two daughters-in-law, Oprah and Ruth. And so after a period of time, Naomi decided to go back home, which was in Bethlehem, Judah. So she told her two daughters-in-laws to go back to their home, which was in the land of Moab. And Oprah decided that she'd go back home, and yet Ruth decided that she would not go back to her home, that she would stay with her mother-in-law, Naomi. And so she went back to Bethlehem with Naomi. But she made the very sweet speech to her mother-in-law in the second chapter of the book of Ruth, and I don't know whether I can quote it all, but I'll try. So after Naomi said, "You go back home, Ruth, and be with your family," and she said, "Entreat me not to leave thee, nor to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. And where thou diest will I die, and there will I be buried. And Jehovah do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." And that's from the American Standard Version. So when Naomi saw that Ruth was steadfastly minded to go along with her, she left off talking to her. And so Ruth and Naomi went back to Bethlehem, and in the course of events, Ruth became a gleaner of the wheat in the field of Boaz, which was a very wealthy man, had a lot of fields, and so she made quite a good living gleaning the fields of Boaz. Later she, being advised by her mother-in-law, Naomi, got a romance going with Boaz, and became Boaz's wife. And there was some individual and some small matters that had to be cleared up before she could be the wife of Boaz, but they cleared those matters up. Had to do with their inheritance, and so Boaz took care of that, and Ruth became Boaz's wife, and they had a son named Obed. Obed was the grandfather of David. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, and David was the man who became the king of Israel after Saul, and that's where our story really begins today.
Let me ask one question.
Okay?
Gleaning, was it custom or law?
It was allowed by law. It was prescribed as the way that the poor people could have a living, and it was manifest in the law that if any grain was in the corner of the field, or any grain fell off of the wagons or was loose on the ground, then the people who did not have fields and did not have grain could go out into the fields and glean that grain, and that was prescribed in the law of Moses. It was not commanded that they do that, but it was commanded that the people who had the grain fields could not pick up the grain that fell from the wagons or that was in the corners of the field, and they left that for those who did not have ways to make a living. And so Ruth gleaned that harvest from the fields of Boaz. Any other question? Okay, we're down at the period of time where the judges come to an end. The last two judges in Israel were Eli and Samuel. Eli was a big man, very fat man apparently. He also was blind when he was judging Israel toward the end of his life. And he had two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, that were not good people. They stole from the people, they lied to the people, and they were very ungodly men. And so God told Samuel through revelation that the sons of Eli would not become judges and would not rule in Israel because of their unrighteousness. And so because of this, Eli's servitude as a judge came to an end, and it came to an untimely end because the Israelites were fighting against the Philistines, which was a normal occurrence. They fought the Philistines almost ongoing. and they lost the battle, and they lost the Ark of the Covenant of God that the Philistines carried back to their cities, and they displayed those the Ark of the Covenant in at least 5 of their cities. I don't know whether I can name them all, but it was Gaza and Ashdod and 2 or 3 of the other cities there that the Philistines had as centers of their gods, which was Ashtaroth and Baal and some of the other gods. And so they displayed this Ark of the Covenant around their temples of their own gods. But that did not please the God of heaven, and so he plagued those people with some serious plagues. And so they voluntarily decided that they couldn't handle the Ark of the Covenant of God, so they sent it back to the children of Israel.
So did you think they carried it the way they were supposed to carry it?
No, they carried it on a cart. In fact, they sent it back on an ox cart. And the way they got the cart to follow the location that they wanted it to go, they took a milk cow and hooked to the cart, and they took her calf and carried the calf out ahead, and so the cow followed the calf. And they carried the calf to the city where they wanted the Ark of the Covenant to go. So the Ark returned back to Israel by way of a cow and a calf.
That's in the Bible.
That's in the Bible.
Never heard that before.
Yeah.
Tell them what the plagues were.
Well, the plagues were interesting. I'm not sure that I know all of them, but there were at least 3 different plagues. One of them was the plague of rats, and another was a plague of tumors, which one version calls hemorrhoids. And the city where the Ark of the Covenant occurred, they had this plague of hemorrhoids, and it plagued so many people till they blew the Ark out of that city and carried it to another. And I'm not sure recall the other plague, but I think there were 3 of them. And so when the Philistines got ready to send the Ark of the Covenant back, they made facsimiles out of gold of these plagues, the rats and the tumors, and they sent it back with the Ark of the Covenant. And so when the Ark got back to where it was supposed to be in the land of Israel, then they had these sacrifices that the Philistines had sent with it, and there were at least 5 of these rats and 5 of these tumors. And does anybody recall what the other ones? I think there were 3 different plagues. But anyway, you can find that in 1 Samuel. But then the Ark came back, and the people of the Philistine country were appeased of their plagues, and the children of Israel were happy to get the Ark back. And in the process of that battle with the Philistines, when the Ark was taken from Israel, the 2 sons of Eli were killed in battle. And when the word got to Eli, he was not only very heavy, but he was blind. He was sitting in his chair, and he was also 98 years old. And when he heard the news that his sons were dead, he fell over backwards in his chair and broke his neck, and he died. So that was the next to the last of the judges of Israel. Now Samuel was the last of the judges, and he was born out of miraculous involvement from his mother. She wanted to have a son very badly, and so she went to the temple where Eli was the priest, and prayed to God that she would have a son. Her husband had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah, and it's kind of strange that they rhymed them like that. I didn't think it. And so Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. And so Hannah prayed that she would have a child, and she promised that if she would have a child, she would give him to the Lord. And so as the season came around, Hannah did have a child, and they named him Samuel, and she kept him at home until she weaned him, and then she carried him to the temple, and he lived in the temple of God for all of his early life. And God spoke to him in visions and told him certain things that were going to happen. And Samuel became a very, very important judge. He was also a priest. He was also a prophet. He was also a very good man. But his two sons were not good. And so God did not like that, and he saw fit that he would not allow his two sons of Samuel to succeed to the judgeship. So we're coming down to the end of the period of Judges, which lasted from the Exodus out of Egypt to the end of the period of Judges, some 396 years. Then the beginning of the kingdom occurred when Samuel anointed the king Saul, or Saul to be the king over Israel. Saul was out looking for his dad's livestock, and he couldn't find them. So he decided that he would go to the seer or the prophet and ask where the animals might be. And so he went to Samuel, who was living down at Ramah at the time, and he told him where his livestock would be found. But he said, before you go back and get those livestock and take them back home, I'm going to anoint you king of Israel. And so he did, because Israel had protested against the judges and wanted a king like the countries round about. And God didn't like that, and Samuel sure didn't like it. But that story is in the 8th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. And yet God said, well, let them have a king if that's what they want. They're not opposing you, they're opposing me, because I've been their king all these years. And if they don't want me to be their king, then okay, so be it. Let them have a king. So they chose Saul. Saul was a man head and shoulders taller than most other people around, and he was dynamic in his leadership ability. And the first battle that he had to come up, he called on the Israelites to come to rally, to form the army that he needed to go out and fight. And 330,000 people came together to be in his first army. And they fought and won the battles. And Saul was very effective in leading the children of Israel for a while. But then he got what we would call the big head. He got thinking that he was a little bit better of himself than he should have. And so he thought that he could offer sacrifices like the priest was supposed to. So he took the position of a priest and offered sacrifice, because Samuel was a little late getting there. And God didn't like that at all. Also, Samuel told Saul one of his first missions was to go down and destroy the Amalekites. Now, if you recall, the Amalekites were the first people that came out to oppose the children of Israel when they came out of Egypt. When they were down at the rock of Rephidim, where they got the water from the rock. The Amalekites came down there and tried to push them back into Egypt. But they would not go, and so they fought the Amalekites and won the victory over the Amalekites, but they didn't destroy them. Well, by now, God has not forgotten that issue, and that's been several hundred years. And so God told Saul to go down, and he did this through Samuel, go down and utterly destroy the Amalekites. Don't save a one, man, woman, and child, not even the livestock. Kill them all, because they resisted the entrance of the children of Israel into the promised land. And so Saul went down and destroyed a lot of them, but he saved the best of the flock. And he saved the king, King Agag. And when Saul got back, Samuel said, well, what meaneth the lowing of the oxen and the bleating of the sheep? He said, all the people wanted me to save those good animals. We're going to make sacrifices with them. And so Samuel made the great statement, behold, to hearken is better than sacrifice, and to obey is better than sacrifice, and hearken than the fat of lambs. And so he went out himself, Samuel did, and killed King Agag and hacked him up with a sword. And that impressed Saul, but Saul did not turn out too good. He kept digressing and doing things that God didn't like. God had placed a great spirit upon Saul when he first became king, but then God took that spirit back, and he placed an evil spirit on Saul. And from then on, Saul was vexed with this evil spirit, which caused him to want to hunt down and kill his very good friend David. Now David came onto the scene as the second king of Israel, and he came into the camp where the Israelites were fighting against the Philistines. You recall the story of how that Goliath had come out of the ranks of the Philistines and defied the armies of God. And when David came down to bring his brothers some food, his brothers being in the war in the army of Saul, he saw the great man of the Philistines, Goliath, which was in the proximity of 10 feet tall. It was 6 cubits in a span, and that measured out to a little over 10 feet. So when David saw Goliath cursing the armies of God, he said, "Why don't you go out here and kill him?" He said nobody wanted to go, so David said, "I'll go." And you recall the story, and a lot of details there that we'd like to tell, but time won't permit. But he went out and killed Goliath, and he took the sword from Goliath, and it wound up in the hands of Abiathar, or Abimelech rather, and Abimelech put the sword in the tabernacle and kept it there for a long time. Well, it turned out that David later needed a sword, and he also needed some food, so he visited the tabernacle and got some leftover showbread, and also was able to retrieve the sword of Goliath so that he could go out and fight against the enemies. Many, many stories about the reign of David, and he was very active. He was very much a warrior, and he knew how to conquer the enemy, and he knew how to take booty from the enemies, and he became a very wealthy man, and he provided protection for some of the shepherds when they were shearing the sheep. You recall the story of Nabal and Abigail, and how that Nabal would not contribute to David's band, and so because of that, God allowed Nabal to die. In fact, he killed him. He had a stroke or something, and he became like a stone, and he stayed that way for about 10 days, and finally he died. And David married his wife, Abigail. And so that gave David 4 wives. I wished I could name them, Abigail and Micah and who was it, Adonai or something of that nature, and then later Bathsheba. And so David had a captain of his army named Joab. Saul had a captain of his army named, I can't call the name right now, it starts with A, but anyway, you would call him who it was. And so Joab and the captain of the army of Saul were not necessarily good friends, because the captain of the army of Saul thought he might become king of Israel, but that wasn't in the plans of Joab, because David was anointed king by Samuel. David reigned for 7 years in the city of Hebron, and then after Saul died, he moved into the palace in Jerusalem and became king in Jerusalem for 33 years. So he had a total reign in Israel for 40 years. That's the same period of time that Saul was king in Israel. And a lot of stories about the life of David, one of which was about his son Absalom. You remember the story of how Absalom was a beautiful young man, had long hair, and he cut it once a year, and he was out, he rebelled against his father, and a lot of stories about the rebellion of Absalom. But later Absalom was riding through the forest on his beast, and he got his hair hung in the browse of an oak tree, and his horse went on out from under him, or whatever he was riding, and left him swinging there. And Joab found out about it, and he went over and took 3 darts and cast it through Absalom, and Absalom then was killed, of course. And the rebellion of Absalom against David, his father, ended. And then David got into a rather a sticky romance, I guess you'd call it, with Bathsheba, who was out bathing one afternoon, and he happened to observe that, and he called her into his palace, and they had an adulterous affair, and a child was conceived and later born, and the child did not survive because God did not want what happened to David and Bathsheba to succeed. And of course, David arranged for the death of Bathsheba's husband, Uriah, and that was a very, very sad day in the life of David, because not only had he committed adultery and conceived a child that died, but he had killed the husband of Bathsheba that was her rightful husband, and taken Uriah's wife to be his wife. And so the story goes on, lots of good, interesting stories there. You'll find that in the book of 1 Samuel. Then by and by it comes time for, I didn't mention the fact that Saul, when he came to the end of his life, was fighting against the Philistines. Those old Philistines just kept coming back. Remind me of I told my wife, the Philistines remind me of a bumblebee. You know, you can get a bumblebee after you, and you can slap him down, just slap him down and keep on. But he keeps coming. And those Philistines did that to the Israelites. And finally they got into a battle, and this is backtracking a little bit, but the Philistines came up to Mount Gilboa. And Saul by now has lost rapport with God, and God's spirit had left him, and an evil spirit had taken his place, and he wanted to know the outcome of the battle of Mount Gilboa. And so he went to a witch over in Endor, and he wanted to call up the witch and get her to call up Samuel, who had been dead many years. And so he called up the spirit of Samuel, and he complained to Saul about why he called him up, let him sleep without bothering him. And but Samuel told Saul, you're gonna go down tomorrow. It's your last day. And so Saul and his 3 sons died on Mount Gilboa. That was Jonathan and Adonijah, and don't recall the third one anyway. He had 4 sons, and the only one that survived was Ishbosheth, who then became king after Saul, contemporary with David, but then he became king of the northern kingdom, which was then beginning to separate from the southern kingdom. And we're going to run out of time here.
Abner was his commander, and he come into play.
Abner, yes, thank you. I thought about it after I went off and left it there, but I couldn't recall it suddenly there. Okay, we're down at the time where the life of David has been very fruitful, very victorious. He wanted to build the temple for God. God said, no, you can't do it. It's going to be Solomon's job. And so Solomon became the king after David. And you recall how that Solomon requested of God that he give him wisdom so that he'd know how to rule the children of Israel. God not only gave him wisdom, he gave him length of days, and he gave him great wealth. And Solomon became not only the wisest man that ever lived, but probably the richest single person that's ever lived in the history of the world. We got a lot of rich people nowadays, but relative to the people around him, Solomon was the richest man that the world had known at that time. Even to the point when the Queen Sheba came up to visit him, she said, the half has never yet been told, speaking of Solomon and his great power and riches and wisdom. So Solomon lived and reigned Israel for 40 years. And then he got involved with so many of the kingdoms around him, and he married their princesses. And he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And these women led him off into idolatry. And as far as I know, he never recovered from that as far as the scripture is concerned. But he died and left his throne to his son Ishbosheth. And David already being anointed king by Samuel. And so David was elevated from being king in Hebron to king in Jerusalem. And, I mean, Ishbosheth, was elevated to be king of the northern kingdom. And then, the southern kingdom was ruled by, Jeroboam for a while, not Jeroboam, Rehoboam. And then, Jeroboam divided the kingdom off and took the northern kingdom, taking 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, and then, Rehoboam ruling 2 of the southern kingdom tribes, and it became known as Judah. So you had a division of the kingdom of Israel. That division lasted until the fall of Israel, and we'll have to talk about that next week when the Assyrian captivity came into play about 726 BC, and Shalmaneser came down from Nineveh and conquered the northern kingdom. He tried to conquer the southern kingdom, but he didn't make it. He had a revolution back at his hometown, and he went back to solve that problem, and he got killed. So that ended the assault on the southern kingdom. But the northern kingdom was taken away into Assyrian captivity, and then later, which we may talk about next week, the beginning of the destruction of the southern kingdom by Babylon. And it was taken over by the Babylonian people some 100 and almost 50 years later. We'll stop right here, and next week, if we go another round, we will talk about the Assyrian captivity and its consequences, the Babylonian captivity, and what happened there. And perhaps we will get into the return of Israel and return of Judah, rather, back to the land of Canaan from Babylonian captivity. Thank you so much for listening good today, and we'll continue with one more session, and then this will probably be our last session about the Old Testament history and the timeline under which all of these things took place.